Next domain, domain 4, good old applications and system development objectives. Okay, in this area, we're going to cover software flaws, also the OSI model, database concepts and security issues, software lifecycle development process, change control concepts, object-oriented programming concepts, and expert systems and artificial intelligence. And I guess one of the biggest flaws about artificial intelligence, if you build a computer system, it's analog as opposed to digital, and it's learning from the user. The user usually makes the wrong decisions anyway, so now you're going to make really dumb computers in the future. Okay, how did we get here? Basically the issues. Most attacks today are successful because of the amount of vulnerabilities reside in software. And again, going back to the good old buffer overflow, it's been around for many, many years. It just comes down to when people are programming, they don't have security in the mindset because they don't usually have the budget or the time for it. I've seen a lot of scenarios to where, again, they go back to the 80-20 rule, is they try to get 80% of the functionality built into the software. If they're trying to sell it at a specific time, they get it shipped over to the customer. And then what they do is they believe they have, let's say shipping is going to be 2 days to go from point A to point B because they're using a courier service. And then they're going to fix the rest of the bugs by the time it hits the doorstep. And then they call the customer over the phone and then try to walk through the setup. Through that time, they still have the dev department trying to fix the rest of the bugs that they know about. And this isn't even the security issue. This is just your basic program breaks. So by the time it gets installed on a system, because they want to be first to market, it may still have, let's say, 5% bugs, but the majority of them are ironed out. And those are just the functionality issues, not the actual security. There's also perimeter security devices are dependent too much upon, bless you. There's also, if software vulnerabilities did not exist, again, security probably wouldn't have as many people in it. So I hate to say it, is the lack of security principles in software design has kept most of us in a job. So, and again, yeah, and I hate to say it as far as, I keep pushing that Microsoft has more vulnerabilities than everybody else, but that's basically just published vulnerabilities, mainly because most people use Microsoft. It's just a math issue, so that's what everybody's going to be targeting. If it ever comes to the fact that people are starting to use Mac more often because the commercials are so much better, it comes down to people are going to find a lot of vulnerabilities on Macs. It's basically just a time issue. Lowest hanging fruit, best investment. Okay, why security in software has been lacking? Basically a lot of reasons. Basically software vendors are trying to rush to market. Basically the first to market is a big thing for a lot of places. Again, worked in a organization. Basically we did software for business management for the automotive aftermarket. And what it came down to is that trying to get features or functionality before the competitor did, so then you get a few more sales. And I know a lot of smaller organizations are at the mindset that every sell is what keeps them in business for the next couple days or whatnot. So again, they're not going to deal too much with the security. They're just trying to get what's there for sale. And I've also seen what's called vaporware. How many people heard of that before? Vaporware in the software market is basically something that doesn't exist until the sell actually happens, and then you create it right after the sell, saying that yes, it exists now, so once it finally gets to the system or gets to the user, again, it's probably not going to be tested, and especially tested throughout the entire program. It may have just added a security vulnerability. The majority of security professionals themselves are not software developers, and most software developers do not have security background or training. Competing society is used to receiving software with bugs and then applying patches to them. This is basically a trained response. And software vendors have not been held liable for insecure code. And that's another issue as far as the downstream liability. There is the possibility that in the future it may change to where if you don't do your proper checking as far as your white box testing, your gray and black box testing, which white box means you have access to the code. You have access as from a programmer perspective. You know exactly what the code's supposed to do because you are seeing it and you have the background of the scope of the project. You test it and just make sure it's working properly, both secure and function. Gray box is the code's compiled and then you're going from a user perspective. You know exactly what you're supposed to put into it, exactly what's supposed to come out of it, and then you try to attack it from that area. Black box is where you get into your fuzzing. So you attack it from the attacker perspective where you have no knowledge of the actual application whatsoever. So when it comes down to it, if you are doing all three of those things, that's your due care and your due diligence, because you have your security coding in place, and then you have the due diligence, which is going to be your testing methodology. If you're not doing it, like I mentioned before, there's a good possibility in the future it may come down to downstream liability, saying that since you don't test your software, we were hacked, and because the 14-year-old that took down our network doesn't have $10 million, now we're coming after your organization for the 900 or 9 million point whatnot. Carnegie Mellon basically estimates there are 5 to 15 bugs in every 1,000 lines of code. It's definitely good to know, as far as with code is concerned, that at least one bug in every 1,000 lines of code, especially if it has not been vetted. With that being said, again, like Vista has 1.5 million lines of code, so chances are there's a couple bugs in there at least. For example, when 2000 came out, there were literally tens of thousands of known bugs when it was shipped, but again, they wanted to get it out to market because they're starting to run a little bit late. And once it got to market, they started pushing out the patches. So there's a lot of issues. Again, the more code, the more probability of vulnerabilities. And that's another reason why a lot of people push Unix environments are inherently more secure than Windows environments by default, because the amount of things that are running. On Windows, they have a lot of things running, so people don't have to install like drivers and things like that. The good old plug-and-play type scenario. And a lot of the Linux environments don't have the drivers installed, so you have to push those per card, or you have to push the service that you're going to be running. So just the overhead's a lot smaller. Okay, usual trend in dealing with security. Security researcher looks at the code. Basically, when they find a security issue, they usually tell it to the vendor. And then the vendor usually communicates back with the security professional in the utopian world, and then says, please don't release it. We're going to be fixing it at this time date. That's when we're going to have a patch. Then they come out with the patch. Once they release the patch and tell everybody to download it, they come out with the advisory saying, this is why the patch was there, because there was this vulnerability. So if you don't patch, we're no longer responsible for anything that happens to your system in that aspect. Again, as I mentioned before, it's usually a security researcher or some individual or entity finds the vulnerability if the vendor doesn't find it themselves. And that's the responsible disclosure. The full disclosure on the other side of the issue is the security researcher or entity finds the vulnerability and leaves the vendor out of the loop. And then what ends up happening is then releasing the point of concept code, which is also the exploit code, out into the wild. So what ends up happening is that the vendor is going to realize that there's a vulnerability and an issue, especially once people start hacking into their software. Okay, where to implement security. Basically, security within software development. This is one thing that, again, throughout the CISSP and throughout basically your professional careers, you need to understand not only software development lifecycle, but system development lifecycle, which includes software, hardware, everything. Security needs to be throughout the entire process, from the design all the way through the retiring of the product, which means that right even when you're looking at purchasing the product, that should be within your mindset as far as if it's going to be, for example, like FIPS 140-2 compliant for the encryption, if that's so needed on your network, all the way to when we do have to get rid of the drives in the system, how are we going to wipe them properly, and so forth. That's one issue, drive wiping. I've seen many cases to where organizations would either think they wiped the drives, or the utilities didn't work properly, or they just didn't wipe the drive, period, and then send them off to auctions. I've seen some other areas to where they have, let's say, 100 different systems, and they have a method to where once the drive's wiped, they put a sticker on it, and they may have forgot, or they may have been in a rush, and they put a sticker on a system that wasn't wiped, or so forth. So when somebody ends up buying one of those auctioned off items, they end up finding all kinds of information. There was it Department of Transportation in Denver had an issue to where a kid basically went to one of the auctions, found it, and he went through some data recovery things. He looked at the drive and saw all kinds of sensitive information, such as addresses, names, social security numbers on one of the computers. And instead of doing the responsible thing, as opposed to calling back the company or organization saying, I know that this came from you because I'm looking at the address information, owner of the system, he ended up going on the internet, telling everybody what he found. And then my understanding is he went through and then tried to offer to sell it to individuals, or basically the highest bidder, after telling the media about it. So that's one of the things to where, again, that's not a responsible thing to do. Yeah. Yeah. So if you ever come across that scenario, then it's always the responsible thing is to communicate with the owner of the data, because chances are, let's say if you paid $100 for the item that you got at the auction, either A, they're going to reimburse you, or they're going to wipe it and then give it back to you, or give you something else. So usually they're nice about it. If they're not, then it's their own fault for things going bad. That's one thing that a lot of individuals will also do is they'll go into eBay and they'll buy lots of hard drives. Or basically, not lots of hard drives, but a lot of hard drives, which are lots of them. But then go through, and for example, if there's 200 of them in the slot, then I'll try to do boot it up, see if it boots up, if there's regular data on it. If there's nothing on it, then they'll try to go through data recovery tools. So for example, like File Recovery Pro is a Windows-based tool. There's quite a few Linux tools as well. Basically just go through and then try to extract data, see if they can find anything interesting. And chances are they probably will find at least one interesting file worth the lot of 200 drives. Yeah, or you can run programs like dban's boot nuke.
Can you get one of the degaussers like they use for tapes and stuff when they work on a hard drive?
They used to, but it's when they changed it from the aluminum to the glass ceramic, basically makes it to where it's not as big an issue, especially with solid state drives. That won't work. Yeah. But when it comes down to it, if you do, for example, like the dban's boot nuke, it's going to go through and then wipe the drive for you. The problem is, if you play with dban's boot nuke, it's a little bit over a meg or so, so it can be on a floppy or it can be on a CD. It's going to wipe all your drives. So do not boot it up off your regular workstation just to see what it does, or to wipe a single drive. It goes for everything. And it's very good at what it does, and it's open, or it's basically freeware. Basically does the same thing as doing a DD. Does everybody know what that command is? DD, which is basically like a disk copy or command copy. Excuse me, basically makes it to where you can, for example, if you do DD space interface, or the internal interface equals /dev/random, and then you do the OF, which is basically your target, the outside interface, which is going to be, let's say, MNT/HDA. What you're going to do is write a bunch of random characters to the HDA, which is going to be your primary IDE hard drive. So basically that's what dban's does, is it boots up into an environment and just starts wiping garbage to the disk. You should have the ability to do both random and zero, or both. And I know a lot of people that use that, and it works relatively well. Okay, security should be, or should not be, kicked back to the bus, just because the deliverable deadline is around the corner. And again, I've seen this a lot on the software side. Most of it is because it was never talked about in the beginning of the project. For example, a customer will come up and say that, yes, we do need to be FIPS 140-2 compliant. The main reason I keep bringing that up is because that's relatively common in software, that you need to encrypt specific traffic going from point A to point B, or data at rest. And a lot of times the client either assumes that that's going to happen to begin with, or they don't know themselves until specific mandates change. And if those change, depending on the organization, if there's a buffer within the contract for that type of work, sometimes the contract may have to be rewritten, or the scope of the project is going to have to be altered. So that's a huge issue right there, is that if the customer does not give all the information that is needed for the people to actually commence work. The other problem, especially with programmers that do not have a security background, they don't know the questions to ask, such as, okay, I know that you're in this industry. How are you going to deal with this type of environment or these regulations? What do we need to do to help you out with that? So basically it's, hate to say it, but it's a lack of information, not just a break in communication on both sides. Okay, conceptual definitions. Basically a basic concept statement agreed upon by all interested stakeholders. States the purpose of the project, and also general systems requirements. And again, with the general system requirements, it's a good idea for both sides of the field to basically know a little bit about both sides of industries. For example, if it's going to be like Sarbanes-Oxley or HIPAA. HIPAA is a big one where the PII, you're not supposed to be able to transmit specific content from point A to point B. such as social security numbers, health information, or whatnot. So it may be the software would be more beneficial if it prevented that from leaving a specific area or it was encrypted. Okay, functional requirements determination. Basically specific system functionalities. Consider how the parts of the system should be interoperated to meet the functional requirements. And also, deliverable for this phase of development is the functional requirements document. The protection specifications development. Let's get adequate protections designed into every system from the earliest stages of development. Useful to have protection specifications development phase in your life cycle of the model. Basically, make sure that through every step that it is basically being assigned to the functionality. It also continues the design and design review phase in progress as well. Design review. Determine exactly how the various parts of the system will interoperate and how the modular system will be laid out, and lays out initial timelines for completion of the coding milestones. Also, you go through deliverables and formal design documents. Code walkthrough. This is a very important part, especially in the security portion. So schedule several code walkthroughs, basically when you hit the specific milestones to make sure that the specific things have been met. Here's the very important part about this whole scenario, is a lot of times the customer will have a specific idea of what they want, but what they want is not truly what they need. So they want specific things to go in one direction, and when you go through the code walkthroughs, they may specifically say, well, I need this, or I don't need that because that's not set to the industry segment that I'm in. That's a huge thing that I've found, at least in personal aspects to when dealing with customers when doing programming, is that they want specific things, but the ways that they want to get there are not logistically feasible. And then also involve only development personnel. Look for problems in logical flow and other design security flaws. So within the code walkthrough, again, have the milestones of what you want to do, what you want to get out of it, but the security issue is a huge portion that's usually left out in the real world. Okay, system test review. Perform an initial systems test using development personnel. Agree that the system meets all functional requirements, and of course have deliverables and beta code. And in this area, this is basically going to be your white box testing. Okay, certification and accreditation. For those of you that have done this in real life, I do apologize. This is one of the things that you have your baseline, so you have all your policies and procedures, and that is going to be where you want to be certified at, and then you have to force all of the systems to either comply or die type scenario, to where if they don't get up to that specific area, then either you have your IATO to say you have X amount of time to meet that compliance, or completely take that system out of the loop. But with that being said, this is one of the main reasons that, for example, change control is such an important item. For example, once you have your CNA process gone through, the system has been certified, so everything's at the base level or the security baseline that you want it to be at. It's been signed off by the DAA, which is going to be either like the CIO, the CEO, basically the owner of the system. The change control process is the document that basically changes the contract of the security baseline. Because that's what the accreditation portion is the signing of, yes, I do believe that the security does meet the standards that we set forth in the baseline. And the contract that they will keep it at that level. I know a lot of organizations will have it to where your system has to go through a CNA process. If it doesn't meet the CNA process, then it actually goes through a beta period to where if you don't go back up to the ATO level, then they actually kick you off until you can reach that CNA process yet again.
So TSEC, is that you go through a CNA process with TSEC, or is that its own?
Well, TSEC is its own environment, but places that go through CNA will be going through CNA, or people that have a TSEC type environment will be going through CNA process, because you have to prove that the specific items are at that level. That, for example, if you want your B2 rating, that's a prime issue there, is that you have to validate that everything's up to spec for that B2 rating. Or the B3 where covert channels are no longer there. The certification process is going to go through to make sure you have all your policies and procedures in place, and then going to test the technology to make sure that covert channels are not possible. And with that being said, once the tests are validated, that's when the sign-off of the DAA makes it accredited. But you'll also see CNA processes in like Sarbanes-Oxley environments, HIPAA. They just may not call it the same thing. But when it comes down to it, it's just a CNA. Is that they have specific guidelines they have to meet. Once they meet it, it's certified, quote unquote, usually by a third-party auditor maybe, and then signed off by the owner of the system, which could be the board of directors even. So, but yeah, definitely know the term DAA as well, because within the CAA process or CNA process, that's going to be one of the most important individuals. There's the certifier, which basically goes through and makes sure that everything's to that level. And there's the DAA, which is the one that signs off. And then there's many other people within that chain as well. Okay, maintenance. Basically ensure continue operations in the face of changing operations, data processing, storage, environment requirements, changes to code and such. And again, back to the change request and control process or change management process. Definitely different scenarios you'd put this in, but as far as code goes, every change should be documented, go through a review process, and again, never be put into production until it's gone through that formal process. Because this is where things like the trapdoors or maintenance hooks can be inserted as well. Okay, life cycle models. Basically, these are formalized life cycle management processes. There's the Winston Royce and Barry Boehm proposed several software development cycles to help guide the practice towards formalized processes. Basically, there's an international standard for describing the method selected in implementing and monitoring life cycles in the 12207, ISO 12207. Software Engineering Institute introduced the Capability Maturity Model. So when I mentioned before the CMM process, that's specifically what it's referring to, is the Capability Maturity Model. The Capability Maturity Model is one of the leading models. Independent assessments grade organizations on how well they follow defined processes, not the quality of those processes or the software produced. Basically, the CMM gradually replaced the CMMI, or that's the newest version, and the ISO 9000 describes standards for formalized organizational processes with documentation. And what it comes down to is that this good old CMM process has actually been borrowed and altered by the IATRP, which is basically organization of the NSA and commercial entities, trying to make an IA CMM process. So instead of only doing it for the software community or for system community, they want to do it for the whole information security life cycle or model. So it's called the IA CMM. And they go through their process, and it's basically 0 through 5. And from the testing that has gone through, I've never seen a full 5 across the board, but I have seen full 4s across the board. Okay, this one right here, basically something you need to memorize, the waterfall model. Basically has it to where you have system requirements, and then you go to system prereqs. If the prereqs do not meet the requirements, then it goes back up the chain. And this is primarily what they're trying to go through. It's through every step. If you do not meet, if the next portion makes it to where the previous step does not work, then you have to go back to the previous step and then alter it so it does. For example, like all the way going down to the testing. If the testing shows failures, you may have to recode and then debug some more and then test some more, and so forth. But definitely, this is one of the models you have to know by heart. Spiral model. Basically has it again to where you go through the determine the objectives, alternatives and constraints, evaluate the alternatives, identify and resolve risk, develop and verify the next level of product, and then plan next phases, and so forth until the end of the development life cycle or the end of the product. And then sometimes you'll have this happen from the inception of the product all the way to the death of the product or the end of life of the product. Now, some organizations will have multiple environments as well. So they'll have a test bed environment, and they'll upgrade everything, test it, and then once it's up to par, they basically do a leapfrog. So once they do the spiral development, they'll do it in 2 different areas, and then the test bed becomes production, production then becomes test bed, and then they'll do the same thing until they upgrade the next test bed, and then make sure that through the spiral environment everything's working properly, then just move back and forth. Okay, the software capability maturity model basically goes through the initial, there's little documentation or formal process. There's repeatable, which is going to be number 2, which is reuse of code begins. There's number 3, which is defined, which is developers operate according to a set of formal documented software development processes. 4 is managed. Basically means quantitative measures are utilized to gain a detailed understanding of the development process. And 5 is optimized, process of continuous improvement. So just like I mentioned with the other standards, the higher you go, the more expensive it's going to be, and of course the more secure it's going to be. But with managed and optimized, it's usually, or each one's going to have a minimum of the lowest set as well. So with optimized, it's going to have everything that's going to be managed, defined, repeatable, and so forth. But it's going to be that they're constantly trying to, again, improve the processes, make the code more efficient, and everything's documented and verifiable. Okay, security control architecture. You have process isolation, basically fundamental security procedures to put in place during system design. You have your hardware segmentation. Process isolates the hardware level by enforcing memory access restrictions. And the protection rings. Again, this is something very important to basically memorize. The protection ring scheme basically means that you want everything with the highest level access at ring 0. You want to put as many rings as possible between the user and the kernel level ring. Because when it comes down to it, if you have, for example, level 1 is where the user sits and the kernel's at 0. If they communicate back and forth, that increases the possibility that level 1 can influence what happens in level 0. But if you have the user at level 3, then they have to influence level 2, which is then going to have to influence level 1 to 0 and so forth. It just makes it a lot harder back to the defense in depth. Okay, malware. This is the fun area. Anybody know the actual term for malware or why it's called malware? Yep, malicious software. Basically, again, in the computer industry, a lot of us are just plain lazy. So malicious software, malware, just easier to say. Okay, what's the difference between a virus and a worm? What's the difference between a virus and a worm?
A virus, like, keeps growing and growing, gets worse.
Close.
It's the opposite.
Yeah.
Virus is the one that doesn't reproduce, the one
Right.
reproduces.
It's kind of like in biology, to where a virus needs some host to spread or propagate. So it can grow and get worse, but it needs some sort of access medium or host. For example, you could have a lot of macro viruses for doc files, which would inject their code into the doc file, so when anybody else opens it, it now infects the system and now infects the rest of the doc files that they create. With a worm, usually has self-propagation capability, which you could have hydras, which are basically worms with multiple transport mechanisms. They may do NetBIOS, looking for shares to transfer on. They may have an SMTP server built into them, so they spread out that way. There's lots of different methods that a worm can spread, but basically they're self-contained and spread themselves. So as soon as they are able to either exploit a system, or if it's through email, which the majority of worms are going to be, they'll have their payload within the email and then try to run within the payload. What's really interesting about the email worms, the majority of the ones that have spread in the past have either A, just been an attachment waiting for people to click on them, and was a storm worm. First time I saw this specific variant was, November 17th. An individual got the email, and what ended up happening was, of course, he sends it to a person he trusted, and then I end up getting the email. So I read the email, and I understand why the guy was a little paranoid, but the email basically read, "I've been paid to listen to your phone calls. If you want to learn out who paid me to listen to your phone calls, you need to open up the encrypted RAR file, and here's the password." So right there is a kind of a targeted attack playing on somebody's paranoia, but it's a multi-level social engineering attack, which was pretty cool. Because what ended up happening was, of course, the guy says, well, it's encrypted, here's the password. He double-clicks on it and then puts the password into it. It opens up, so he's able to double-click on the actual item, which is not something anybody should do due to user awareness training. But he did it anyway. But when I got the actual email that was forwarded to me, of course, put it on a system, I opened up the RAR file and then copied the information, put it into a system, looked at it through a hex viewer, and instantly saw the first two characters were MX. And because I've seen a lot of file headers in the past, I know MX is going to be an executable. It's usually portable executable. Looked further on and it said SCR. So what the name actually said was the date, which was I think was 11-17- so last year 07, and then a couple characters .mp3 ... And that's what you see in WinRAR is the ... And the person was playing on how big WinRAR opens by default. And because after about, it was like 30 or 40 spaces, it had .scr. But when it was compiled with the Windows Media Player icon. So it actually looked like on a lot of systems with MP3 would look like. So, of course, they were playing on the two things to where the paranoia, he sees a password, he sees it encrypted, therefore somebody must have manually gone through the process, clicks on it, and then double clicks on something that he shouldn't have clicked on to begin with because they renamed the item within inside of it. So he, of course, was infected until Symantec made the inoculation for it, which luckily was only a few hours later. But here's the other beautiful thing about it. Some email filters specifically block RAR files, zip files, exes, all these other files. However, some email filters have the exception for if it's encrypted, because you have to send sensitive information from point A to point B in an encrypted format. So it instantly sees this RAR file as being a quote-unquote encrypted file. Therefore, it allowed it through the email filter. So it was never caught within the email string. So it was not only a technical attack because it got past some access controls, but it was multiple layers of social engineering, which is a very advanced worm, by the way, compared to the planning you had to go through it. Most worms go through a specific vulnerability, and again, I hate to target Microsoft, but in Microsoft's email readers, basically they allow for HTML. They also allow for iframes in HTML. So for example, if you have Outlook Express or Outlook, if you open up an email with just a simple act of previewing it, it's going to run the HTML. If you have an iframe and you put the iframe source as being the attachment name, you have to have a very specific command to do this, a very specific pointer to do this. So blocking the pointer would basically make it to where viruses would no longer spread. You basically, the simple act of previewing the email, not even opening it, then runs the attachment through the iframe and then runs on your system with the rights that you have with the system. So now a lot of the email clients no longer allow you to transfer exes or SCRs or zip files because that's hard-coded into the security patch of Outlook. And then there's another group that you can actually change, but there's about a dozen that you can't that's physically hard-coded. MBRs, anybody know what that extension goes to? Not master boot record, but multiple database, MDB, my fault. MDBs, which would be the Access database, Microsoft even bans you from transferring those through Outlook with a security patch, which I just thought was funny because that's their own code. But yeah, MBR is going to be master boot record. Some of the viruses way back when actually targeted the master boot record. So sometimes you could put code into there, and that's why a lot of the motherboard manufacturers would go through and look for specific code to see if it's been altered. So when you're booting up the system, it says it's running that antivirus check at the BIOS level. That's what it's looking for, anything that could have potentially changed the BIOS, and sometimes the master boot record. There's a few, like Chernobyl, that was an old one, to where you put in a floppy disk, and basically it would instantly go from your floppy disk as soon as it was read and infect the system that the floppy disk was inserted into, so you didn't even have to run any of the programs on it. And then now every floppy disk that you put into that system would also be infected. Yeah. So they were really bad in schools, especially when I was there, to where somebody, you clean it up, somebody out of the 300, the 1,000 kids that you have in that environment are going to come back with an infected disk at one time. So,
how many lines of code is a typical WordVirus, do you know?
some of them go overboard, so they may see 1,000, some even more. Some viruses you could even put to potentially, like let's say, bounce off of Outlook itself, and then use its email sender, so basically an OLE command or an API command. So you could probably get away with 50 to 100 lines of code. I made a piece of software that was caught as a virus with 5 lines of code. Basically, all I was doing a network connection. And this is where I originally found out the signatures are so weak on antivirus, is because I got a virus, which was a VBS. I saw it basically going through email. I pulled it out and then looked at the VBS code, and then I copied and pasted the string, basically the variable, to connect to a NetBIOS share. And then I wanted to do that so I can transfer a couple files just through an administrative thing. So I wrote a 5-line VB script to basically open up the share, transfer a file, and then basically be done. Well, it actually got caught as the virus that it originally caught. So all I did was change the variable, because I think it was AAA to ABC, and then it was no longer getting caught by the antivirus. So that's how weak a lot of the signatures are. There's also good old logic bombs, Trojan horses, and timing attacks. But some of the biggest threats you'll probably see from the internet side can be your worms, looking for specific exploits or specific holes in your system, like the good old code red. Everybody remember that one? Spread pretty quickly.
Sasser was already up there too.
Yep. Okay, malicious code objects, viruses. Basically, this is a piece of code that requires a host application to reproduce itself. Again, just like the biological term for it, it has to have some sort of host, so it's technically not a living issue. Virus types, there's macro viruses. These are easy to create because of the simplicity of the macro language. There's the boot sector virus. This is malicious codes inserted in the disk boot sector. There's the compression viruses, which when decompressed, it initializes. There's stealth virus. There's polymorphic virus, and then multi-apartheid virus. The polymorphic basically changes every time it copies from one entity to another entity. The problem with the polymorph is that usually they have the same key string. So a lot of the antiviruses can catch the majority of the older polymorphic code because they're looking at the signatures for the code generation, not the actual code that is generated. Then multi-apartheid virus infects both boot sector and file system. There's also a metamorphic virus that basically has different capabilities every time it copies itself over. So it's constantly changing like a polymorph, but it's also changing some of the things that it does. For example, one system it may infect, it may have like a random table on how it's supposed to transfer, which one way would be SMTP, the other way would be NetBIOS, the other one would be trying to attack somebody's RPC for DCOM, which probably is not going to be that effective for most systems. But what's funny about this type of scenario, how many people here have played with Metasploit? Metasploit has a lot of exploits built directly into it, and then a lot of basically payloads as well. What's interesting about it is it's free to download. It's fun to play with. It has one called the RPC DCOM, which was fixed mid-late 2003. So you would think that these are no longer on the internet. What's interesting about it is if you do a scan, especially for like IIS or whatnot, or specific for that OS, you'll still probably find several systems out there, especially if it's an internal network, especially a small, medium-sized company. They may not have done security patches in a while. I had a friend that actually, I asked him to put up an XP system, basically XP Service Pack 1, because he didn't believe anybody would be able to attack into the system. And what was funny was, as soon as he put the IP address onto the internet, I sent the good old Metasploit exploit over, and then got a tight VNC connection back into it, so we saw the mouse move, just as a basically point of concept that bad things can happen really quickly. What was funny about it is that I had the time to download Firefox, and while I downloaded Firefox, installed it, he was sniffing the traffic, and then he started seeing other people start to attack the same thing. And basically that's when he closed the connection because somebody else started doing some things on his system or potential virus that started destroying it. So he wiped it almost right away, but that was probably within about 5, maybe 10 minutes. Within the viruses, there's the different types of them. Again, the macro, the boot sector, stealth, polymorph, and multi-apartheid. Okay, virus. First one was written in '83, or the first documented one, of course, written in '83. Probably demonstrate the concept because a lot of people did not believe that it was possible, and basically it is the Morris worm. This is an historical reference. There's a good possibility you may see it on either this test or others, mainly because it is basically trivia. And it's estimated there are about 1.25 million different viruses today, and of course this is going to change. If If you ever go to a site called Secunia, there's a bunch of them out there, but this one specifically I personally like because it has multiple references, multiple resources. It actually has a bunch of different viruses that come out and then say, okay, Trend Micro came out with it, Symantec, McAfee, and a lot of times you'll see a bad day where, I guess for virus writers at least, only 10 viruses are found. And then on a more active day, you may see 60 to 80 viruses that are found in that instance. And what's really interesting as far as the viruses and the malware that comes out or that has been found, or even if you go to, for example, like xssed.org, you look at all the sites that are being listed during spring break, Thanksgiving and Christmas, which are generally American-based holidays, you'll see a lot less traffic on those sites, a lot less things being actually validated. So either that means that people are not testing as often, or people in America are actually finding them, or the site is not being updated at the time because it's based in America. But for example, like on Zone H, on those dates, usually it's not as big an issue as well because the majority of the attacks or defacements are coming from outside the states. Probably because of logistics or things like that. Okay, worms. These basically self-reproduce, different than a virus because they're self-contained programs. And worms do not have to be compiled code. They can be script, like VB script, JS script as well. Just they need to be able to transfer from one area to the other. I have seen a nice little worm, for example, like a good old IRC bots. The first instance of an IRC bot I saw was actually a worm package. It was a script that was running, but within that script, it was basically copying over the PS exec tools, PS tools. How many people have heard of that before? From sysinternals? Basically, Microsoft acquired the sysinternal tools, and now you can get it off their site. But PS exec allows you, as long as you have a username and password for a valid system, you can transfer information using basically the administrative protocol. Not only transfer it, but run an actual file on a remote system. So this batch file was basically running through, doing the PS exec, transferring an IRC client with basically a reg key and the PS exec tools and a copy of itself over, and then running another batch file which would go through the installation process of the IRC with a specific username, password, IRC server it connects to, and did a few other things. And what was funny in the batch file is it looked like a dumb way of doing things, but it was very effective because it was going through the basic top 20 administrator passwords. Administrator no password, administrator, administrator, administrator blank, administrator, just a few other things. So go through the PS exec and just basically try to dictionary attack its way through 20 tries and then go to the next IP address. And then it would try to go through each individual IP address within the subnet that it was currently on. And the beautiful part about it was connecting to the IRC server using the username and password that was in the script to do the transmission part so anybody could see what it was. There was over 10,000 systems connected to this IRC bot. So again, not knowing what commands to push to do anything with it or anything like that, but the only reason it was found and the client called me was because they were no longer able to do file and printer sharing because what they ended up doing, they compromised the system and then changed the usernames and passwords. So the majority of the users that were doing anything, the passwords were now different, which was probably the biggest mistake the attacker could have done because it would have been on there probably 6 months or so before this small company would have been able to find anything wrong with it. And the only reason they probably would have is that so much disk space was used on this file server that they wouldn't be able to do backups. But yeah, that's the only reason they found it was because file and printer sharing no longer allowed them to connect to the resource because it was asking for a password. Okay, good old logic bomb or time bomb. Basically, it's an event triggers the execution of specific code. Again, a lot of people will use this if they're developers or sysadmins, mainly as their quote-unquote job security. So what they'll do is they'll put a script on there, and it looks for a specific file or event. It usually deletes or changes the event. So what they're going to do is once a month, they're going to change the event back to a specific item or add the file. If the file or event does not exist, then it's going to actually execute the bad thing, which is usually going to be altering data, destroying data, deleting data, potentially even trying to do it like a DD copy, or that DD instead of random, possibly even 0 to an actual hard drive or remote system. So again, the logic bomb usually done from the inside out. Sometimes it may be done by an attacker, because once they load the logic bomb on, they expect they're going to have a specific amount of time and then leave. So once the connection is no longer there and severed, it may be a week and then start wiping everything. Because a lot of people, as soon as this type of event happens, they look for connections directly surrounding that event. So that makes it to where you're destroying evidence in the assumption that they haven't already found you. Also, Trojan horse, program disguised as another program. Useful for programming or programs that contain hidden code, and also exploiting the authorization process enabled it to run when it normally shouldn't. A lot of the freeware programs out there would have Trojans in them. It's relatively common to go on places like Kazaa, Limeware, BearShare, any of those P2P applications. And if you download anything, a lot of people will then experience some strange things on their system because now it's been backdoored or Trojanized. So when it comes down to it is that some programs, it will be an actual Trojan pretending to be another program. Other instances of Trojans are, it's the legitimate program, but code has been injected into that program to backdoor or make it do something strange. Then also rootkit. Somebody know what a rootkit is? Rootkit is basically an application that is designed to do multiple things, hide itself from the operating system and from the user, and then potentially backdoor the system. So when it's the maintaining access issue, to where technically you could have some sort of backdoor and make it to where you're using Netcat, and then you're using some other sort of application to make sure the process is not being seen by the user or by scanners, and then sometimes even hiding the code into outside areas of the hard drive. I know a lot of the hard drives are, for example, if you get a 500 gig hard drive, some manufacturers don't do math the same. So when it comes down to it, 500 gigs from one manufacturer is not 500 gigs from another manufacturer. So you look at it and you may see like 460 gigs is actually there, one maybe 478 gigs. But with that being said, even though their math is different for marketing purposes, whenever you do the actual formatting of the hard drive, it's not going to use 100% of the hard drive because sometimes the geometry just does not fit. So sometimes you have a little extra space at the very back side of the hard drive. So whatever you put in this outside area, if you know the actual physical address of that item, you can only read and write data to that specific space, and the operating system is not going to be able to see it. The only way you'd be able to see it is through some sort of disk editing utility. But yeah, rootkits are basically designed to hide themselves from the operating system, which would then hide themselves from other items as well. From forensics perspective, a lot of times you look at the timestamp of the file and the size of the file. If the size is smaller or larger, then you know something's probably happened to the file. If the timestamp is off, something's probably happened to the file. There are some rootkits that will basically make it to where you grab the target file and then you grab your file, and then you can make your timestamps identically match the target item. So people looking at it just normally, most system administrators will bypass it and just think it's a normal file. Same thing with the file size. If your file is smaller than the target file, you can add stuff inside the exe and physically make the file just as large as the target file. So the only way you can really see if it is a bad file or not is if you do, for example, a hash on the file. A lot of forensics tools will allow you to do that. This is where you have the known good hash and then you match it with the known bad hash. And Tripwire does that as well, basically making it to where it can tell if things have been altered because it keeps basically a database record of the fingerprint of the file. If the file has been changed, it doesn't matter about the timestamp or the size. It matters about the actual content within the file.
Can you image the hard drive and work on it?
Yes, as far as forensics, that's usually what ends up happening, like incident response or whatnot, especially if it's a workstation. If it's a server, most people don't have the time to do a true image, so they may do some sort of logical copy. But that's usually in an environment where, for example, they're going through $100 million a day off their website, then you don't have time to take it off or down for an hour. But if it's a server that nobody really accesses and you can afford to keep it down for 2 or 3 hours, you can do a bitstream copy of the hard drive, which is the best copy to do because it's going to do everything from that one hard drive to the other. So if anything's been deleted and it's still physically on the drive, you can get it. If you don't do a bitstream copy, just do a file copy or a backup copy, then you're going to miss all of the deleted files, all of the items that are in the slack space and unallocated area as well. So yeah, definitely imaging or the true imaging, which is the bitstream copy, is the preferable method for investigation, both incident response and forensics. But yeah, and then there are definitely some tools out there. I know NIST has a hash set looking specifically for known bad files, known rootkits, things like that. There's also some rootkit finders. For example, the good old Hacker Defender is a Windows, or the most well-known Windows rootkit. That definitely has quite a few signatures out there, and some of those signature definitions that work great in the forensics tools because you're able to import them and then basically hash each individual file, and then it searches its database for what you're able to hash. And then there's also the hardware virtualization rootkit and the virtual machine-based rootkit, which is going to be beyond the scope of the CISSP more than likely. But again, since the CISSP evolves very quickly, especially with the item writing workshops and whatnot, there's always a possibility for that, but chances are it's not going to be on there. And the virtual machine-based rootkit is where somebody like Subvert, which was done by people within Microsoft and the University of Michigan, or individuals that work for both, were able to create this application that transferred over to a system about 55 meg worth of data. Virtual PC is what they focused on, and then basically hijacked the operating system through a specific vulnerability, and then basically lifted the operating system up, installed the virtual machine, and then encapsulated the operating system within the virtual machine. Then within the hardware virtualization, you're looking at the red pill and the blue pill. That deals directly with AMD 64-bit processors and deals with the hardware virtualization piece within the processor. There has been another one written specifically for the Intel processors in 64-bit, but the red pill, blue pill, or the blue pill was specifically for the AMD. But again, those are probably beyond the scope of the test, but it's something you may come across in the near or distant future, as rootkits are getting a lot more complicated.